Image of Butch Cassidy taken at the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie in 1894, when the young robber was still facing charges for horse theft. The photograph, taken right after his conviction, shows an early stage of his criminal career before the clear formation of the Wild Bunch, which would become active at the end of the next decade. Wild Bill Hickok, the famous gunfighter and sheriff who patrolled the Kansas border towns in the 1860s, is seen here with his signature long coat, silk scarf, and Colt pistols, a style that earned him a reputation for elegance amid the dust of the Old West trails. In 1877 at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, the Lakota chief Touch the Clouds from the Minneconjou Division posed shortly after surrendering with Crazy Horse to the U.S. Army, ending the 1876 Sioux War. The scene marks the transition of Plains leaders from warrior autonomy to military oversight, and a restricted life on the earliest federal reservations. Bronco Bill, then a young cowboy in the New Mexico Territory, appears with his relatives in front of the forest near where they lived in 1887, when extensive ranching drove the economy of the Great Plains, and the recent end of the Apache Wars still influenced everyday life on the frontier. In the image, Mary Fields, 6 feet tall, stands next to the mail wagon wearing a wide hat and holding a shotgun, symbols of the Western Trails. Born enslaved in Tennessee in 1832, she gained her freedom after the Civil War, and in the 1880s was hired in Cascade, Montana, as the first black mail carrier. She traveled 300 miles a week, carrying letters that kept isolated settlements connected. William Barclay Bat Masterson in Dodge City, 1885. A former sheriff and gunfighter, by then a newspaper columnist, he returned to the city he had helped pacify in the previous decade. The image captures the turning point between the Old West ruled by cattle and the arrival of the train, when Dodge ceased to be a remote Kansas outpost and became part of national commerce. My grandfather rides his favorite horse in the early 1920s, on the banks of the Bighorn River near Hardin, Montana. The scene shows the routine of small ranchers after World War I, when cattle were still driven on horseback and railroad lines were just beginning to connect rural areas to the markets. His wide-brimmed hat and simple saddle highlight the cowboy culture that persisted against mechanization. Wyatt Earp's Northern Saloon in Tonopah, Nevada, around 1902. After his famous stint in Tombstone, Earp ventured into the desert silver rush and built this place to quench the thirst and gaming appetite of newcomers. The simple wooden structure reveals the hurry of pioneers. Within less than a decade, production would drop and the town would go into decline. Image of cowboys working along the open frontier of the American Southwest, captured by Irwin E. Smith between 1905 and 1912, when the era of large ranching operations still dominated Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, just before the end of open-range grazing. At age 77, Red Cloud was photographed in 1898 by J.H. Bratley, while living on the Pine Ridge Reservation. 3 decades earlier, he had led the Lakota-Cheyenne alliance that halted the construction of forts in the Powder River Valley, forcing Washington to negotiate the 1868 treaty. After the Wounded Knee Massacre, he worked to protect subsistence resources against federal agents. Wicks, Montana, December 1886. During the silver boom, the snow-covered village served as a waypoint for miners and families who crowded near the smelters and the Northern Pacific Station. Kerosene lanterns cast a flickering light over wooden workshops, while sleds hauled raw ore from nearby tunnels to the central foundry. In 1884, on the then isolated San Carlos Reservation in the Arizona Territory, a traveling photographer produced this small calling card that preserves the oldest known image of the Apache leader Geronimo, taken during the period when the federal government kept his people under strict surveillance after repeated surrenders. Charles A. Siringo and W.T. Sayers appear around 1900, when they worked for the Pinkerton Agency on the plains of the American Southwest, tracking cattle rustlers and infiltrating gangs to gather evidence used in federal courts. The pair exemplifies the shift from frontier vigilante to corporate private detective, foreshadowing infiltration tactics and systematic reporting in a West that was modernizing. A Texas cowboy around 1870, when the great cattle drives headed from the Big River to the railroads in Kansas. The puncher box, decorated with Kiowa or Comanche beads, shows the sometimes peaceful, sometimes hostile interactions with the Southern Plains peoples. Boots with spurs, a wide-bladed knife on his belt, and a revolver were the basic gear for driving cattle, hunting buffalo, and defending against thieves on the frontier. In the image, Soapy Smith, Bob Ford, and Bat Masterson in Creede, Colorado, a silver boom town. In 1892, these men converged there. Smith ran gambling houses. Ford, on the run after killing Jesse James, sought safety. Masterson, ex-Dodge sheriff, worked as a journalist. Their gathering reflects the tense atmosphere of western mining towns when the silver lode declined and law was uncertain. Quanah Parker, chief of the Comanches, photographed in Oklahoma in 1890. Son of the Anglo-American captive Cynthia Ann Parker and the warrior Peta Nocona, he became a central voice during the reservation era. He negotiated land, supported school building, and kept rituals like the Sundance, trying to balance cultural survival with federal demands. A resident of the gold-bearing stretches of the Mojave Desert, this miner dug into the sandy slope to create a cool, cost-effective shelter, typical of Randsburg during the Southern California gold rush peak in 1897. The underground home reduced extreme temperature swings and saved on hauling expensive lumber to the remote region. OK Corral, site of the famous 1881 shootout, is seen here after the Great Fire of May 1882 that burned part of Tombstone to ashes. Charred boards, a fallen gate, and scorched ground reveal the vulnerability of pine structures to the fires that ravaged Arizona's mining districts. The city began a reconstruction funded by silver mining. Dodge City around 1878, a strategic point on the cattle trail at the Kansas frontier, newly linked to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. The city thrived as a livestock trading post and a place of entertainment for cowboys, while sheriffs like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson tried to impose the law. Deadwood, South Dakota, around 1870, then a rough settlement on the banks of Whitewood Creek, built in Lakota territory. Pine shacks, dirt roads, and tents housed lumbermen and pioneers waiting for news of gold in the Black Hills. Starting with Custer's 1874 expedition, this town would boom, drawing miners, merchants, and a weak legal system that tried to curb violent disputes. Stephen H. Meek, a veteran fur trapper who guided wagon trains on the Oregon Trail, appears at Fort James around 1880 alongside his dog, a companion on journeys across the Sierra foothills. At that time, the fur trade was fading with the rise of railroads and new urban lifestyles, but it still kept small outposts like this California fort alive, remnants of the western frontier. Billy Brooks, known in Kansas towns as a fast shooter and occasional deputy, poses here around 1872, the peak of the cattle boom on the Chisholm Trail. 2 years later, accused of leading a horse theft in Caldwell, he was tried on the spot and hanged, a common fate in frontier territories where the law was still taking hold. Naiche, hereditary chief of the Chiricahua Apache, and the legendary warrior Geronimo, are shown together at Fort Bowie, Arizona Territory, in mid-1886, just days after agreeing to the terms of surrender with General Miles, and while awaiting the train transport that would take them under military custody to prisoner-of-war camps in distant Florida. In the mid-1890s, workers, many of them newly arrived European immigrants, were preparing the roadbed and laying tracks for the line out of Quigley, a small mining settlement in southwestern Montana, critical for shipping gold from the Garnet Slopes to the smelters in Missoula. After 5 years of raids to capture him, federal deputies and lawmen who had laid siege to the cabin of Ned Christie, a Cherokee leader accused of killing a deputy marshal, gathered in front of the camera on November 1, 1892, just hours after setting fire to the fortified shelter in the Wauhilau Hills, Indian Territory. Undertakers gathered in front of the municipal morgue display a freshly slaughtered pig on a plank table, soon to be roasted. The feast marks the inauguration of the city's first firefighting company, a civic accomplishment in the summer of 1881, when authorities relied on volunteer funds to equip manual pumps and organize fire watches. In the image, the family is gathered outside their rural home in Tennessee, 1909. Their work clothes show the southern farming lifestyle in the early 20th century. The father's shotgun indicates hunting and defense. The dog underscores the practical bond between man and property. Children of various ages point to family continuity before World War I. This photograph is cited by those who argue that Brushy Bill Roberts was really Billy the Kid. On the left, the gunfighter in 1881, shortly before his supposed death at the hands of Sheriff Pat Garrett. On the right, Roberts in the late 1940s, already living in Hiko, Texas. Between 1949 and 1950, he traveled to Santa Fe, presented testimony, and requested a pardon from the governor, claiming he had survived the Fort Sumner shootout. But the Territorial Commission rejected his claim for lack of proof. An African-American soldier from the 10th Cavalry Regiment, a Buffalo Soldiers unit, poses alongside 3 Apache scouts at Fort Whipple, Arizona, circa 1885. The image reflects the period when the U.S. Army enlisted indigenous allies to track down resistant groups in the final phases of the Apache Wars, just before Geronimo's surrender and federal control over the territory. Image of Billy the Kid around 1880. The photo, taken in Fort Sumner or possibly in the New Mexico Territory, shows the young gunfighter wearing a wide-brimmed hat and holding a Winchester rifle. Billy, born Henry McCarty, was a key figure in the Lincoln County Wars, a landmark of the Old West. On July 14, 1881, at age 21, he would be killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett, an event that sealed his legend.